The Babadook is not scary, but motherhood can be terrifying. So, just as I was about to post this, I see a trailer for The Woman in the Yard. That's gonna definitely fit this theme. And so maybe look forward to a part 2. I don't know. With that said, here we go. There's going to be spoilers for both The Babadook and the others in this one, folks. But you've had a decade to watch the former and over 2 decades to watch the other, so do with that what you will. The Babadook is a 2014 film following a woman and her son after her husband, the boy's father, dies in a car accident driving the wife to go give birth. The boy, Sam, clearly stresses his mother, Amelia, out to no end. Sam displays some behavioral issues that inevitably get him in trouble with both the school administration and his peers.
Oh my god. Did he hurt anyone?
However, Amelia's reactions become more disproportionate and crueler as the film progresses. The small family is cast aside by many around them, and we see both Amelia's sister and Sam's school shove them aside.
She never comes to our house. Mum told Dad she didn't want to go to your house because it's too depressing.
The only real consistent support we see the family have is that of Mrs. Roach, aka the best character in the film. Amelia is deeply depressed. She is neglecting herself, her son, and their home. She is neglecting herself by not having a tooth that is clearly bothering her throughout the film looked at by anyone. She neglects her home by ignoring dirty dishes, which eventually brings cockroaches? That last part is not so clear as there may never have been any roaches. It's a horror movie. The phantom bug thing is common. The Others is a 2001 film that follows the lives of a woman and her 2 children after her husband, the children's father, dies in the war. Yeah, they're a little similar, aren't they? Despite their similarities, I wanted to include them both because 1, I can, and 2, because The Others depicts a much more subtle presentation of the mother's struggles. It is not until the children start dropping mad hints that we start to tune in.
Mummy went mad.
We often think of disorder in general as obvious, as in your face, or as completely derailing an individual's day. But that derailing isn't always so obvious to those looking in from the outside. If a train gets from point A to point B safely, but did so with extreme mechanical dysfunction, and the operator did everything in their power to not let those on the train know that there was an issue, would you say that that train was operating under safe circumstances? Is that train okay? Would you want to continue to operate the train under these conditions without having a mechanic give it a little look-see? No, of course not. But mothers often do not have the luxury of refusing to do their job when something feels off. And society gets to act shocked and indignant when the train inevitably derails. Too real? Too bad. At the time of these films' release, prolonged grief disorder was not added to the ICD or the DSM. Mind you, this diagnosis was proposed as early as 2009, but it wasn't until March 2022 that it was added to the DSM-5-TR and the ICD-11. Needless to say, Amelia and Grace both meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. Disclaimer alert! Please keep in mind that we are still talking about horror movies. And most folks who struggle with PGD are not violent. Horror movies have to up the ante and are not fully based in reality. We do see both Amelia and Grace meet the criteria, and I will go over how, but I want to be very clear that harming children is by no means a hallmark of prolonged grief disorder. Do not let grief is dangerous to those around the griever be your takeaway today. Like 99% of mental health diagnoses, the danger here is to the self and not to other people. Let's be real clear about that. Ultimately, I blame our culture's dog shit relationship to grief for everything that follows. Out of the myriad problems that come from Western civilization's Babadook-like reach, our denial of grief and its traditions certainly makes rank. When confronted with conversations about death, people freeze up. We go out of our way to avoid talking about death. And we see that with Amelia and Grace in both films. This is seen in The Babadook when Sam tells the woman at the grocery store that his father's in the cemetery. Or, and The Others, they just don't bring it up. and we often approach things that way. This denial of death brings us to the first point of this video, the ever-popular 5 stages of grief. Okay, another disclaimer alert. The 5 stages of grief was first brought forth by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. Some folks get all up in arms about this model, saying it can't be held up in quantitative studies, it is not linear, not everyone does all 5, yada yada yada. But Kubler-Ross herself later went on to say that this model was never meant to be definitive or linear, and that she wishes she had been more clear about that in her first publication. So the controversy around this model is largely asinine, and basically serves as a way for scholars to, well, actually, about grief. Alright, I'll break it down a little more. Not everyone experiences all 5 stages of grief. In fact, more stages have been proposed. We're not doing that today, but I promise you they're out there. Is it all quantifiable? No. Is the 5 stages of grief a guideline for what you should be doing next? I guess people use it that way, and I can see why, but no. There is no quick fix for grief. There are no number of stages you can complete to come out normal on the other side. Is this model linear? Absolutely not. We love to proclaim healing is not linear, but somehow for grief, people still think it is. Grief is lifelong, darling. It will change presentation multiple times, but it'll still be there. After all, you can't get rid of the Babadook. Let's back up a minute. I stated that both Amelia and Grace meet the diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief disorder. Now, we should never be placing these labels on people we do not personally work with, but they are fictional characters. I don't think I'm exactly slinging libel here. Additionally, I do not yet possess diagnostic authority, so these are just my professional impressions, and I do not have a professional relationship with Amelia, Grace, or anyone watching this video. We cool? Gravy. Now, the DSM has its issues, we'll say that. But that is a barrel of wasps for another time. Prolonged grief disorder is only diagnosed when it causes clinically significant distress and arose after a loss that occurred a year or more ago for adults or 6 months ago for children. The timeline is clearly defined in the Babadook as being about 7 years post-death. The timeline in the others is a bit more foggy, however, it is stated that the father went off to war a year and a half ago. To be diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder, an individual must also have either or both an intense yearning or longing for the deceased and or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the deceased. For children, this occupation may be around death itself, and these two, or one of the two, must have been experienced at least daily for 1 month. We do not know if they've experienced it daily for a month, but considering they've been in kind of a static situation since the death, we're gonna go on a limb here and say yes. Mind you, these are fictional people. If they were real people, I would want to know specifics, I would want to know times, I would want to know what it looks like, I would want to know so much more. I'm being good. It is unclear whether Anne or Nicholas or Sam, the children in these respective films, meet this criteria, but we are going to operate under the assumptions that their mothers definitely do. Both Amelia and Grace experience this intense longing, but have actively rejected preoccupation with thoughts and memories. We see this intense longing with Grace as she is clutching her husband's clothing on the floor of their bedroom, asking, "Where are you?" while also exhibiting a freeze response when asked about the doctor.
I'm the doctor, by the way. What's your name?
Rose.
Nice to meet you, Rose. Run for your life.
I mean, the master of the house. Amelia has quite literally hidden away her memories of her husband, while later we see her sleeping in bed with his violin. Do we know these symptoms have occurred at least daily for the past month? Well, no, because despite my best efforts, I cannot interview fictional characters. However, based on what we know about how they live their lives, how they speak to their children, one can make an educated guess. Something that we would absolutely not do with real people. There are also additional criteria that must be met for a person to be diagnosed with PGD. An individual must experience 3 of the following, at least daily, for the past month, though it can be more than 3. Identity disruption, e.g., feeling as though part of oneself has died since the death. Marked sense of disbelief about the death. Avoidance of reminders that the person is dead. Intense emotional pain, anger, bitterness, sorrow related to the death. difficulty reintegrating into one's relationships and activities after the death, problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, or planning for the future, emotional numbness, absence or marked reduction of emotional experience as a result of the death, feeling that life is meaningless as a result of the death, also known as nihilistic beliefs, intense loneliness as a result of the death. Now, let's go one by one and see if these criteria apply to either Amelia or Grace. Identity disruption. Now, this one is tricky as we do not know a lot about the women pre-loss. We do know that they both wanted to be mothers and were content in their marriages. This does seem to have shifted, however, we will mark it as needing further evidence to support criteria for both accounts. Marked sense of disbelief about death. Grace certainly meets this criteria, to the point that she tells the house staff she does not know where her husband is, while telling her children that he will return after the war.
Daddy is coming back, though.
All the while, Grace knows her husband died while serving in France.
You're here. You're here. They said there was no hope.
Amelia does not display this criteria. Avoidance of reminders that the person is dead. Both women meet this criteria, with Grace denying the death outright, and Amelia hiding away all evidence that her husband even existed. Intense emotional pain. Definitely, as it is the plot of both films. The intense emotional pain is also displaced onto the children in both films, which, as I previously stated, is not typical. And in cases where it is displaced, it is often seen more as verbal snapping, irritability, or apathy, instead of, well, strangulation and suffocation. Can I even say those words on YouTube? I mean, I've said death at least 40 times at this point. So I think if YouTube is gonna flag it, we're past that point. Difficulty reintegrating into one's life and activities after the death. We clearly see that Amelia has lost a close bond with her sister and is experiencing a great deal of burnout at work. As for Grace, well, big spoiler here, folks. Grace takes the lives of both herself and her children. So yeah, Grace meets the criteria, and she also certainly met it before she went mad, but no one was around to recognize or help her with that. Emotional numbness. Amelia meets this criteria. We see that her home is completely drained of color. We see her watch television with a blank expression, an expression that is more blank than that what you would typically associate with someone watching television. Amelia is unable to tell her son she loves him. And Grace, well, we are uncertain as to how emotionally engaged she was before the loss. So we'll give this one a needing further evidence to support criteria as well. Feeling as though life is meaningless. Well, given their actions, one would suspect so. We cannot ask the women themselves directly, or their writers directly for that matter, nor do we hear either woman in either film state this sentiment outright. It is highly hinted at throughout both films, but for argument's sake, we are going to say does not meet criteria at this time. Intense loneliness. Now, this is highly demonstrated by both women, with both women wishing their husbands were back with them. Amelia repeatedly hallucinates the return of her husband, whereas Grace is reunited with her husband briefly. If the children had not also interacted with him, I would definitely think he was a hallucination. Can ghosts hallucinate? Horror movie, Muddy Waters, what have you. So the grand total of diagnostic criteria for each woman is 5 of 8. Again, have they felt this way daily for at least a month? We don't know. But the film does show enough for that to be an educated guess. Amelia straight up tells Sam she has not been good since his father died, and admits,
I'm sick, Sam. I need help.
In the context of the film, this may have been a Babadook manipulation tactic, but it's still true. With all that out of the way, let us revisit the 5 stages of grief. We briefly touched on how both women display a level of denial around their losses. In going over the criteria for PGD, this became more evident. What was not mentioned in going over the criteria was that Amelia does not let her son have a birthday celebration, as it was also the date of his father's death. This is such a horrific detail, and Amelia is really stuck in a horrible place here. Death anniversaries are difficult. They can often bring waves of grief that may have been dormant until that day. For Amelia, this is also a day she should be able to celebrate. The chaos of the universe turned what should be a wonderful day for this family into some sick monkey's paw situation for the mother. Her pain is immense, and I cannot fault her for reacting poorly in this scenario. No one has a guideline for an event like this. I guess Jennifer Kent gave us one. May we never have to use it. The next stage of grief is anger. Again, not linear, but in list format, this is next. Oh boy, do we ever see anger in these films. Amelia repeatedly shows anger in multiple ways throughout the film. Grace's anger is hinted at repeatedly by her children when she is not around, and via the big reveal that the kids and herself are dead by her hand. Grace also displays anger differently, but it is consistently shown throughout the film. The reason I wanted to highlight the others is not because of the big reveal at the end, but by the much more subtle ways Grace displays anger throughout the film. She states that she is fed up with her children.
I'm fed up, do you hear me? I am fed up with you!
I didn't do anything.
She punishes them easily and excessively. She is also generally short with everyone around her.
I want to see those plates empty in less than a minute, is that clear?
Now, women do not owe everyone in their lives kindness, but I think it's safe to say they owe their children kindness? Yeah. For Amelia, these displays of anger begin at the very beginning of the film after her flashback. Amelia is likely also experiencing PTSD, which is often comorbid with PGD. We see her scold her child for hugging her too tightly. She later yells at another mother at a birthday party. This mother frankly deserved it, but we see that this is out of Amelia's typical character.
I don't even have time to go to the gym anymore. It's ridiculous.
That's a real tragedy. Not having time to go to the gym anymore. How do you cope? You must have so much to talk about with those poor disadvantaged women.
Amelia yells at her son for talking, becomes cruel and tells him to eat and calls him a pig. At this point, the Babadook has taken complete control and she is not herself and becomes actively violent towards her son. She goes on to hallucinate her dead husband, telling her to bring him the boy so that they can all be together again. Yeah, let's not listen to that hallucination there, Amelia. Bargaining is also quite blatant in these films. Amelia straight up reveals wishing her son had died instead of her husband. He drove her to the hospital and died because of it. There's a twofold blame game happening there. Grace argues with her ghost hubby about returning to a war that's already over.
Why did you have to go to that stupid war that had nothing to do with us?
And states that the real reason her husband went to war is because she wasn't enough for him. Which, based on the ghost sex that follows, I'm assuming wasn't the case. What? This movie is way more unhinged when I try to explain it. Bargaining is not always this cut and dry. And most of the time, the griever's actions are not this questionable. Bargaining often looks like what-if questions. Like, what if the ambulance had gotten here sooner? What if I had driven them to the hospital instead of waiting for the ambulance? What if I had noticed something sooner?
Why couldn't you have stayed here like the others did?
In Amelia's case, it may look like, why didn't I just give birth at home? Or why didn't we call the medics to come to us? Grace hints at other forms of bargaining she may have experienced. She states that it was inevitable that the island they live on would be occupied and taken over during the war.
The whole island was occupied. What did you expect?
Which translates into bargaining as, what if he had known that the island would be occupied either way? Then he wouldn't have had to go to war. As for depression, the signs are obvious. Both women struggle with daily tasks and have a generally pessimistic view of their lives. Their irritability with their children also indicates depression. It is easier, day to day, to remain numb than it is to face one's grief and feel the crushing weight of it. Like the Babadook, grief never goes away. But like we see Amelia do in the film, we can learn to live with it.
My husband died the day that Sam was born.
He got killed driving Mum to the hospital to have me.
Acceptance is the final stage of grief, because it will certainly circle back around to other stages, often at big life moments, anniversaries, or when you just see the relationship that you have lost out in the world. Acceptance does not mean being okay with. And this is something we run into a lot. Folks tend to hear acceptance and think it means signing off on it. Acceptance around grief is saying, I cannot change what happened, and I have to keep going. It is the fading of blame and guilt, the softening of debilitating sadness and anger, and being able to think ahead instead of being hyper-focused on the past or going through the motions in the present. If you feel stuck in grief, please reach out to someone. This may be the work I do, but we do not work together. No video is ever going to be a replacement for speaking about your individual struggles and your memories of your loved one. Motherhood is a topic of horror I will certainly be revisiting. But in relation to the two films we looked at today, the horror is in having to act like everything is fine. I have watched loved ones parent through grief, and it tears at your heart. Children ask questions we cannot answer. Children react in ways that some adults do not understand. We see this through Samuel and Anne's supposed bad behavior. See, I personally have had grief come into my life throughout my development. And I distinctly remember how it felt different at each stage. The initial grief I experienced as a child felt different than the initial grief I experienced as a teen, which felt different than the initial grief I've experienced as an adult. And the grief that I felt as a child also feels different at these different stages, and so on and so forth. Grief changes throughout one's life, and that initial grieving will look different at each stage of development. Do not hold a child to an adult or even a teen's standard. Better yet, do not hold anyone to any standard when it comes to grief. It is not linear, it is not simple, and it is not something one can just be done with. For those of you who may be struggling to talk with children about death, I will always point folks towards Caitlin Doty's 2012 video, Talk to Children About Death. The only thing aging that video is the Domo stuffy. Unfortunately, the current event that served as the inciting incident for that video is just as common. While a parent's love should be stronger than the Babadook, grief is not always that simple. It goes without saying that both of these women definitely needed help. In October of 2014, Jennifer Kent described her depiction of motherhood in The Babadook. Now, I'm not saying we all want to go and kill our kids, but a lot of women struggle. And it is a very taboo subject to say that motherhood is anything but a perfect experience for women. The Babadook is not scary, but motherhood can be terrifying. So, what do we do from here? Check in on the caregivers in your life. Take duties from them or show love through acts of service. Let them complain about their kid without giving them any nice platitude about how lucky they are, blah, 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 blah. They know that, but just because you love someone doesn't mean you don't need to vent about them from time to time. Particularly someone who is dependent on you for every damn thing in their lives.
Mom! Mommy!
We need to talk openly about grief. Let others know it is okay by acting as an example. I know this is not easy. I have a certain nonchalance talking about death and grief because I come from an Irish-American family. We typically have a more intimate relationship with grief and death in a way that can come off as creepy. Westerners are generally horrible when it comes to grief. I said this at the top, but it didn't always have to be this way. While doing some digging for this video, I came across a 2017 article from The Guardian. And apparently, what creeps people out may be beneficial after all. Kevin Toulis writes, "In the Anglo-Saxon world, death is a whisper. Instinctively, we feel we should dim the lights, lower our voices, and draw the screens. We want to give the dead, dying, and the grieving room. We say we do so because we don't want to intrude. And that is true, but not for these reasons. We don't want to intrude because we don't want to look at the mirror of our own death. We have lost our way with death." The wake Toulis describes is still a world away from what my American family engaged in. We definitely had the party with the corpse in the room. But as I got older, even that began to fade, because those who would have insisted upon it were no longer with us. Toulis goes on to state that, "For our ancestors, a wake, with its weight of obligations between the living and the bodies of the dead and living, was a pathway to restore natural order to the world, heal our mortal wound, and communally overcome the death of any one individual. An act in our current thin psychological jargon of closure." Bingo! I am enmeshed in the psych world, and I know We've done a job at preparing folks for grief, talking about grief in general, and preparing clinicians to work with those who are grieving. I had to take a special concentration in grad school to have one class in grief. Death is intrinsically tied to life. We know that. We've always known that. But still, it's icky, and we don't want to get into that, okay, Emily? No, not okay. I am always going to be the person who brings up the stuff no one wants to talk about. I recently got into a conversation with my family about the significance of post-mortem photography, because of course I did.
Do you have any idea what this might be?
It is a photograph album, ma'am.
No, but look, they're all asleep.
They're not asleep, ma'am. They're dead.
I took the not at all surprising for Emily position that, considering the limitations and restrictions around photography of the time, post-mortem photos of loved ones served as immense displays of love. I was told that was creepy, but I still disagree. I am not saying to go take pictures of the deceased, but I am also not shaming anyone if that helps their grieving process. I have long been intrigued by death practices around the world, because again, of course I have. But it always struck me how in the West we are expected to just move on. Historically, this wasn't the case. And in other parts of the world, it is still unheard of. Toulis ends his article by stating, "In communally accepting death into our lives through the Irish wake, we are all able to relearn the first and oldest lessons of humanity. How to be brave in irreversible sorrow. How to reach out to the dying, the dead, and the bereaved. How to go on living no matter how great the rupture or loss. How to face your own. And how, like Sonny, to teach your children to face their death too." Sonny is Toulis's father. When I first watched The Babadook years ago, it didn't really hit for me. My family just never denied grief, so I didn't have context for the film. We openly talked to those who passed on. Some of us thinking we were talking directly to their spirit, whereas others of us had the deceased's voice so ingrained in our minds that we knew what they would say. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's spiritual or relational, because the line between those two is tenuous at best. The Babadook came out 10 years ago, and in the years since, I've been reflecting on the film. I went through waves of hating each character, except Mrs. Roach. She's an angel. Feeling immense empathy for each character. And ultimately, just getting really upset with how motherhood and grief are approached in our culture. You know, just a small complaint. The culmination of all of that churning is this video. Is this the last time I'll talk about grief? Absolutely not. Writing this, recording it, and inevitably editing it serve as a reminder to myself to go give my own Babadook some worms. And may you remember to make time to do that for yourself as well. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.